Supreme Court case of McCulloch versus Maryland was an extremely important case in the United States history. It was an example of the struggle between the proponents of the strong federal government and those against it. It began in the year 1816 when the Second Bank of America was chartered, and a branch opened in the state of Maryland in 1817. However, the state of Maryland wished to limit the powers of the federal government, therefore it imposed a tax on the notes from the bank not chartered from the state in 1818.
A conflict occurred when James McCulloch, cashier of the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the United States, refused to pay a tax. Thus, a lawsuit was filed against him, which would make a lasting impact on the role of the federal government and interpretation of the Constitution.
The case was first tried in the state court of Maryland. However, after the state court ruled against McCulloch, he decided to appeal to the Supreme Court in 1819.
All rise. Chief Justice John Marshall will be presiding over the court today.
You may all be seated. Today, we have the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Maryland, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
McCulloch, please state your case.
The state of Maryland has unjustly taxed the Second Bank of the United States, and for this reason, we come to trial.
Maryland?
The federal government does not have the authority to establish a national bank because the Constitution does not explicitly say so. The Second National Bank of the United States is unconstitutional.
The Constitution does not prohibit the federal government from establishing a national bank, and so it is within Congress's implied rights to charter this bank. However, the states do not have the authority to tax a branch of the federal bank. This tax is being implicitly directed towards the federal bank because our bank is the only alien bank existing within the state.
Because Mr. McCulloch's bank is located within Maryland, it is to comply with the laws of the state and is not exempt from these taxes. This bank is expected to adhere to the laws, and Mr. McCulloch has violated the decree requiring all alien banks in the state of Maryland to pay a tax.
McCulloch, final rebuttal.
The state of Maryland has no right to place a tax on a bank chartered by the federal government. The federal government should trump any conflicting state laws. The taxes that the Second Bank of the United States is being forced to pay are unjust, as states should not have the power to tax the federal government.
Maryland, final rebuttal.
By establishing this bank and denying the state to tax it, the federal government is infringing upon the state's rights. The federal government should not have this much power.
The court will now have a short recess. We'll be back with a final judgment. After the most deliberate consideration, it is the unanimous and decided opinion of this court that the act to incorporate the Bank of the United States is a law made in pursuance of the Constitution and is a part of the supreme law of the land. It being the opinion of the court that the act incorporating the bank is constitutional and that the power of establishing a branch in the state of Maryland might be properly exercised by the bank itself. We proceed to inquire whether the state of Maryland may, without violating the Constitution, tax that branch. We are unanimously of opinion that the law passed by the legislature of Maryland, imposing a tax on the Bank of the United States, is unconstitutional and void.
Hello, welcome to After the Fact. I'm your host, James Murphy. Happening. The Supreme Court unanimous ruling handed down March 6, 1819 against the state of Maryland was groundbreaking, establishing the right of federal government to interpret constitutionally loosely to carry out its powers. The ruling was one of several important court cases by Chief Justice John Marshall that helped shape American government. Today we have Chief Justice John Marshall here with us to justify the court's decision. Chief Justice, will you please explain how the court came to this decision?
government does indeed have the authority to establish a national bank, because the Constitution states in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, otherwise known as the Elastic Clause, that Congress has certain implied powers. It may make laws necessary for carrying out the enumerated powers. These enumerated powers include the power to lay and collect taxes, borrow money and coin money, and regulate foreign and interstate trade, and establishing the Bank of the United States carries out these functions. There is no phrase in the instrument which, like the Articles of Confederation, exclude incidental or implied powers, and which require that everything granted shall be expressly and minutely described.
So, John, why was the state of Maryland denied the right to tax the federal government?
The decision was made for two reasons. One, the Constitution expressly prohibits states from taxing the federal government. Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution, or the Supremacy Clause, states that the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties are the supreme law of the land, and declares anything in the Constitution or laws of any state in the contrary notwithstanding. The power to tax involves the power to destroy. So taxing the national bank would undermine the authority of the United States, and the states have no right to take action that could destroy an institution of the federal government. If the states may tax one instrument employed by the government in the execution of its powers, they may tax all the means employed by the government to an excess which would defeat all the ends of government. Also, the Constitution states that the power of the government derives from the people, not the states that comprise it. The tax that Maryland tried to levy was unconstitutional because it trespassed upon the rights of American people. By taxing an institution of the United States, the state was taxing all American people, but state is only accountable for a fraction of the population. Therefore, the tax infringed upon the constitutional rights guaranteed to the people, from whom power ultimately derives. The powers of the general government, it has been said, are delegated by the states, who alone are truly sovereign, and must be exercised in subordination to the states, who alone possess supreme domination.
The Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, made a huge impact on the way the American government operated from here on after.
It established that the federal government had the power to charter a bank and utilize its implied powers not explicitly stated in the Constitution.
In the conflict of the balance between state and federal powers, this insubordination of the state to the supremacy of the federal powers was affirmed.
This case asserted the powers of the federal government and denied the states the right to take action against a federal institution.